welcome Melissa.
Hi guys, how are you?
Doing
Hey.
well. Happy to see you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the introduction.
Absolutely.
All right, shall we get started?
Let's get started.
Okay. All right, well, I'm actually going to start with a story that may be familiar to most people. It has been adapted over many years. It was originally an essay written by someone named Lauren Isley, and it goes something like this. One day there was an old man walking along the beach, and he spotted a young boy that was very tenderly taking starfish, lifting them out of the sand and throwing them back into the ocean over and over again. And the old man approached this young boy and said, "What are you doing?" And he looked up and said, "Well, I am taking this starfish, throwing it into the ocean because if it stays on the beach, it's going to die." And the old man looked around and very kindly said to him, "Listen, there are miles of beach and there are hundreds and hundreds of starfish out here. So that's not really going to make a difference." And so the boy very nicely looked up at him, then looked down, picked up another starfish, threw it into the ocean, and looked up and said, "Well, I made a difference to that one." And that story is really a reminder that one person and one story can have an impact on many others. I think we can all agree, those of us who have, which is all of us, who have lived through prohibition against this plant and the war against this plant, that war has been very damaging to humankind, most disproportionately to communities of color, to communities which are economically disadvantaged. We have lost years of potential scientific breakthroughs and potentially life-saving medicine, all because of racism and greed. Because prior to those 80 years, this plant was an integral part of many civilizations and helped in many, many ways. And I just want to remind people that even though I'm going to talk about my story with CBD, this is really something universal and that all of us together can make a difference. So as Lisa said, my name is Melissa Gibson. I'm actually speaking to you right now from my store in Woodstock, New York, where it is 3 hours later than what you guys are experiencing. It's 7:12 here. And I've had this store for the last year, and we have a consciously created collection of CBD, hemp, and other cannabis products here in our store. And we have about 30 different brands and over 100 products, but 72% of our products are from women-owned companies, and about 75% are New York State companies, because here we are in Woodstock, New York. So in about 2016, I had an event that Lisa told you about, a health event that led me to discover this plant. But I have a background in business. My background specifically is in business development consulting, social enterprise, grassroots development, branding, and marketing. And I'm just going to tell you my story of how I came to the plant, and hopefully it's something that resonates with you. But again, it's just one story of many. So the one thing that I've noticed from my story and listening to hundreds of other people's stories is that there seems to be a common theme, or at least some common stages to these stories. I'll tell you what they are. The first is some kind of event or environmental condition that creates a need. In my case, it was a health issue, which I'll go into. The next stage then is awareness of this plant, or the cannabinoids or the elements of this plant, and a discovery process where somebody spends the time and does the research to figure out more about what this plant can do and what products might be available. After that, there's a period of experimentation or practice where somebody is trying to figure out how to incorporate this plant into their daily lives to even see if it's something that can help. And even with my expertise, when people come into my shop and I'm matching them up with the right product, and they ask me how much they should take to get the desired effect, I still encourage them to develop their own relationship with the plant, because we're all different and we're not even the same from day to day. So that experimentation process is really part of creating an effective relationship with this plant to have success. The next stage, because once we know that it works for us, at least in some way, is to seek out community and potentially become an advocate for this plant. Once you've adoption comes right before that, where you've experimented, and so now you've adopted it into your life and you feel confident that can help, and you feel compelled to tell others about it. Join community like Tokeativity and speak with others about this plant, and then potentially advocate for this plant. And that seems to be the general theme for these stories, and mine isn't any different. So in 2014 and 2015, I was struggling with having been diagnosed already with several autoimmune disorders. I contracted Lyme disease in 2003, and I was diagnosed with celiac disease in 2005. In 2015, I was experiencing a lot of stress due to some personal issues in my life. And I was feeling some fatigue, but I didn't really pay attention to it. I am an active person, I'm an athlete, and so I kept chalking up all of my issues and aches and pains and fatigue to just getting older or working out too much, whatever it may be. And then I was on a snowboarding trip with my husband during the holiday season in 2014. And I woke up in the middle of the night because I heard someone banging on the door to our hotel room. And I asked my husband, I'm like, can you go check who that is? Who's doing the banging? And he looked at me and he's like, there's no banging. And it turned out that sound was the knocking of my own heartbeat in my body, and the reverberation of that heartbeat that was so loud that it felt like somebody was making a really loud noise. And of course it was over vacation, so I didn't immediately go to the doctor. I lost a bunch of weight. I had some stomach issues. But when I finally went to investigate, it turns out I had something called a thyroid storm. And it was brought on by Graves' disease, which is a form of hyperthyroidism. So that's when your thyroid produces too much of the hormone. It's a very finicky hormone. It's like a Goldilocks hormone because it has to be just right. Not enough, you have a problem. Too much, you have a problem. Has to be just right. So this was causing all of those issues that I had, and I became very weak. And I started working with an endocrinologist because they're the ones that have the expertise. And I started taking medication to prevent my thyroid from producing or overproducing these hormones. And through that medication, I would have some success and I would get things to calm down, but then inevitably they would race again. And there's a direct correlation between that and the stress I was experiencing in my life. And I know that we all experience stress, especially these days. And it's really one of the most damaging things that could happen. It could prevent sleep. It could prevent nervousness, anxiety. And I was experiencing all those things, even with the help of the medical community. So at some point, the doctor was really giving me my options of either radiation or surgery. And while I know that those practices work for many people, I was also interested in seeing if I could find a natural solution. And at the time, I was working with an organization in upstate New York that was looking at the potential of hemp back then to even potentially revitalize the agricultural economy in the state. And that's when I was introduced to CBD. And so I gave it a try. I started taking it on a regular basis, and lo and behold, my symptoms from my Graves' disease started to dissipate. And it wasn't just that I felt better. The thing is, when you're battling something with hormones, your doctor takes your blood and you can actually see the results on a test of what's happening. And my thyroid counts were going down and down and down until finally they were pretty much in remission, and I stopped taking the medication. And I'm not saying that CBD cures thyroid disease. I'm explaining that in my story, in my experience, this is what happened. And it was enough to completely have me pivot my personal and professional lives to learn more about this plant and because I have a business background, to create a business around it so that I could help others and share this with others. So in 2016, I started Hemp Humanity. And just to give you some context, in 2018, the Agricultural Improvement Act was passed, which is affectionately known as the Farm Act of 2018. That was when CBD became decriminalized and became legal federally. But prior to that, we were using the 2014 bill. It was a little bit of a gray area. And so I wasn't able to sell CBD online. I wasn't able to, no one had a CBD store. There's still some difficulty with financial institutions to this day, but back then it was even harder. You couldn't open up a checking account in New York State if you were in hemp. I couldn't even put a picture of a hemp leaf or mention cannabis on my social media sites. You had to be very stealth. My social media account was shut down because I promoted an educational event around CBD. It was called CBD Curious, where I talked about what CBD is, how it can help, answered all the questions. And that alone was enough to flag me on Facebook. So I just wanted to give you some context because thankfully we've come a really far way, but back then it was difficult. And so I did my best. I did pop-ups, I did farmers markets. I shouted from the rooftops. I created my own events. I joined communities. There weren't that many trade associations around that time. Fortunately, we have many wonderful ones like your organization, but back then there weren't too many, and most of them in New York were in New York City. So I traveled to New York City on a regular basis so I could meet my people. And that's where I began relationships with some incredible women in this industry who all had their own story and their own reasons for getting involved in this industry. And we supported one another and we did what we could, but I stayed with it. And then in 2020, we had the great pause, the COVID pause. And I started doing some consulting with CBD companies, and I was doing a little bit more business to business work because that's my background. But in September of last year, I had an opportunity to take over a sublease in the town of Woodstock, where I live in New York. It was a beautiful location, and friends of mine who owned a chocolate store were condensing their other location, and I had the opportunity to open up a brick and mortar shop. Now, previously, I had not thought that a store or a brick and mortar shop was going to be in my business plan. I didn't see that for me. But as soon as I had the opportunity to open my doors and to have conversations with people one-to-one, I knew that this was the way I was going to go into the future and how I was going to have an impact on this industry and on the health of others. So every day my shop is open, people come into the store and they can ask me questions about CBD. I have a little sign that says, ask me about CBD, CBC, CBN, THCA, CBDA. You're going to learn a little bit more about the different cannabinoids later on in tonight's program. But I have an opportunity here to give a million different elevator pitches. Just imagine, we are in a tourist town. People walk by all the time. They come in, and I only have a few seconds to teach them about the endocannabinoid system, explain to them about cannabinoids, what they do, and sometimes even the basics of the difference between hemp and marijuana. I also have conversations about legalization because even though I am a hemp store, I live in New York and we passed the MRTA at the end of March. But now there's a long road and a long gap between legalization and regulation and eventually retail. So I have an opportunity to talk to people about that, and I welcome that opportunity. And I love talking to people directly and hearing what they have to say. It also gives me the opportunity to talk more about the whole plant. You can see some bags behind me. So yes, there's CBD, there's cannabinoids, there's terpenes, but there's also the whole plant. And why chop down a tree that's been growing for 50 years when you can grow hemp for 3 months and create this beautiful bowl? Or you can create hemp plasticware out of something that's not toxic. So I love that opportunity. Hemp in particular is something that can feed us and clothe us and shelter us and fuel us and free us. And this is something that is near and dear to my heart. And like I said, I welcome all the opportunities to talk about this plant. But there's one other really important reason why I do what I do. And that has a lot to do with my 25-year-old son, whose permission I have to share the fact that he uses cannabis successfully in his recovery from opiate addiction. This is someone who was born with anxiety that was debilitating. And as we all do, we experiment and try to figure out what feels good. And he went down that path, and it's been a really difficult road. And remember that stress I was talking about, that was a little bit of a trigger for these immune issues. Well, that's all a part of it, but it's a good story. And I'm that mom that would walk around those marches with a sign that said, cannabis isn't a gateway drug. It's an exit drug. But I'll tell you something, I changed my tune. It is a gateway, but it's not a gateway to moral depravity. It's not a gateway to addiction. It's not a gateway to a life of pain and suffering and loss. What it is a gateway to healing. It's a gateway to self-care. It's a gateway to more sustainable and regenerative practices that can heal humans' ability to live on this planet. And it's a gateway to a future where we all have more control over our bodies, over our health. And I want to restore this plant to its rightful place in humanity among all of us. So you tell your story about CBD, you share it with the world, and you can be that spark in those stages of discovery and awareness and experimentation and adoption and advocacy. And that's how one person makes a difference. That's how we can make a difference, one story at a time and one starfish at a time. And I thank you so much, Tokeativity and your community, for the opportunity to share my story. Hopefully it sparks others. And kudos to you and what you're accomplishing. And thank you for bringing us all together.
Oh, thank you so much. You've definitely inspired many a person in the virtual room. Lots of wet faces right now. So thank you so much for your story.
Thank you, Melissa. That was so incredible. And we need to hear more stories, like yours, where folks are discovering, cannabis and CBD and the healing elements associated with it. There's so much that we are getting to know, and there's so much that we don't know. And it's up to us to really pioneer this space. Thank you for being a pioneer in this space and for putting yourself out there so early on. And how amazing that you've helped heal your body and also support the health of your family. I think that's what this is all about. This movement is all about radical healing. And we can do that through plant medicine. And we're so incredibly thankful for having you here with us today. And we hope to see you bopping around inside the event and that we get an opportunity to connect with you even more.
Absolutely. I am going to stick around. I'm excited. And, together we need to break that stigma. And it's happening. People are openly having these conversations. And now more than ever, people need this plant.
They do. They do. Thank you so much, Melissa. We'll see you inside the event. Thank you.